We could say that proper Star Trek really ended with the final episode of Star Trek Enterprise, the season 4 finale. These are the Voyages. A creative misstep for sure. A terrible way to end a show that had at last found form. But at least it was still Star Trek. It was just a bad episode of Star Trek, made all the worse by being the show's series finale. Yeah, not a good note to leave things on, I think you'll agree. But I think there was plenty of life left in Enterprise, and indeed the wider Star Trek franchise, and still a great opportunity to take it forward into the 25th century, post-Star Trek Nemesis and post-Star Trek Voyager. And I think there was potential for a new series set in that era. But instead, we didn't get that. Star Trek went where it had never gone before, that's for sure, into a reboot. Star Trek, which had been, up until that point, chronological, it had been one timeline, one consistent continuity, had now departed from that. Star Trek was started all over again. It went right back to the beginning with the original series characters and the USS Enterprise and the 23rd century, except it was different, very different. They recast all the characters. Star Trek from 2009 is a film written by Robert Orci and Alex Kurtzman and directed by J.J. Abrams. The film sought to change things. It sought to shake up Star Trek and turn it into a fast-paced, action-oriented film franchise in the vein of the Transformers franchise. It didn't work out, to say the least. Star Trek 2009 was relatively well received by general audiences at the time. I don't think it's aged well creatively. Hardcore Star Trek fans were either uncertain or disillusioned by the film, however. The story was nonsensical. I've covered the various plot holes in my review of the movie. The breakneck pacing and visual style just weren't suited to Star Trek, which is supposed to be more cerebral science fiction. There were 2 follow-up films in this Kelvin timeline: Star Trek Into Darkness from 2013 and Star Trek Beyond in 2016. Into Darkness was perhaps the worst of the 3. The most brainless action movie I've ever watched. Every arbitrary action set piece seems designed to distract you from the fact that the story is just littered with plot holes, and if it's not the action and explosions distracting you, it's the shaky camera work, the Dutch angles, and the endless lens flares making the film extremely unpleasant to look at. The second and third films also failed to make the kinds of money at the box office that Paramount hoped they would. This film series was where Star Trek changed. It's where the Star Trek we knew died. After these films came Star Trek Discovery, another prequel, this time a TV series, but this time taking place before Kirk, Spock, and the original series crew. And it was just as much a departure from the classic Star Trek as the Kelvin timeline films were. The dialogue became contemporary. The characters spoke like millennials and Gen Z. The series was dark. The characters were often antagonistic and unpleasant. And the writing was bland and lacked the ingenuity and substance of the first 5 live-action TV series. Since then, there's been little to shout about. The first 2 seasons of Star Trek Picard were even worse. The time of edgy, dark Star Trek had well and truly arrived, it seems. Life was cheap on that first season of Star Trek Picard. I seem to remember a lot of needless graphic violence. This was also the first Star Trek series to not focus on a Federation starship and Starfleet crew, and its main character, Jean-Luc Picard, was now disillusioned and a shadow of his former self, kind of disgraced and living in isolation. Sounds very familiar, doesn't it? Sounds a lot like old Luke Skywalker. It wasn't until the third season of Picard where the show would be somewhat salvaged. Star Trek Strange New Worlds shifted gears to a more colourful, lighter tone, but the writing quality remained the show's Achilles heel, and it often relied too heavily on gimmicky episodes and comedy. The nadir of the franchise was to follow with the recently cancelled Starfleet Academy. There's really nothing to be said about that show that I haven't covered extensively in my episode reviews of the first season. And the less said about that dreadful Section 31 TV movie from a few years ago, the better. To be honest, I'd almost forgotten about it. For the first time in over a decade, there is no new Star Trek film or TV show being filmed at the moment. The final seasons of Strange New Worlds and Starfleet Academy are in post-production, but that's it. The future of Star Trek is unknown at present, though there have been whispers of a Jonathan Archer-centric Star Trek United series, but nothing concrete at the moment. The decline of the franchise began when Star Trek tried to be something it was never meant to be. A brainless popcorn action film franchise that started back in 2009. This was the turning point. This was the mistake. This course correction was unnecessary and has led to the continued attempt to reinterpret Star Trek for a new audience. This was the moment when Star Trek was no longer being made with its dedicated fan base in mind, but with non-Star Trek fans in mind first and foremost. Nothing has been the same since the people running the Star Trek franchise entertained the idea that Star Trek should evolve into something quite different. Something unrecognizable. But you can't mess with the formula and still have success. The fundamental misunderstanding is that Star Trek is first and foremost a niche. Yes, it does have a worldwide fan base, but it's never going to be Star Wars. And it really shouldn't try to be. Something about what makes Star Trek work makes it unsuitable to resonate with the general audience. It's just the way it is. That's not necessarily a bad thing. It is, at its core, philosophical, technical, and intellectual, and more suited to long-form episodic television, seasons where it can do a variety of different types of standalone stories. But when Star Trek drifts too far away from its core identity, its core values, it loses its fan base, the fan base that supported and maintained interest in it for decades. So I think that's a basic overview of how the Star Trek franchise arrived at where it is now. Thank you very much for watching this video. If you haven't already, please subscribe to Computing Forever. Hit that notification bell to be notified of future updates. Hit that like button. Thank you very much for watching. Take care, and I shall see you in the next video. Bye-bye.